Welcome to Freezing Action with the correct shutter speed. Let's take a look at which shutter speed you should use to freeze all human action. Now, I generally recommend 1/1000th of a second shutter speed or faster to freeze any type of human action. The human body is moving very quickly, very fast, and I learned many years ago from sports photographers, if you shoot 1/1000th of a second, you'll end up freezing the action at a pretty good rate. If you go much slower than that, a 500th of a second, or you're shooting indoors and sometimes you're tempted to not raise the ISO too high, you may be shooting 500th, 250th a second, you're going to get some motion blur when the subjects are moving, and it's not going to be as pleasant. It's not a cool type of motion blur. So I've shot a lot of things from Badgers to Packers, Vikings, and using sports photography, helping to have 1/1000th of a second. Sometimes it's maybe small college soccer, small high school soccer, and that's fine. This is shot at 1/1000th of a second. Making sure the shutter speed is fast enough is important to freeze the action. This might mean that at times, if it's a cloudy day or getting low at night or a night game, you have to raise that ISO. If you're shooting indoors, you might have to raise that ISO. Nowadays, you can raise the camera 3200, 6400, and it looks pretty good. Sometimes even boost it even more than that if you have to get to that shutter speed to that 1/1000th of a second range. Now, if you're shooting outdoors in good sunlight conditions, you probably don't have to. In fact, I had fun using a slow shutter speed called a panning technique, intentionally lowering the shutter speed to as slow as 30th of a second in this example, and shooting an f/22. Then I followed the subject, continue to click and take that turn. So you follow the subject, click, and you keep turning and keeping them at the same rate. You're trying to match the speed so the subject matter and the camera are moving at the same position. And technically then the only part that's moving is the torsos, and of course everything in the background is moving during that shutter speed. So at times you might want to not freeze the shutter speed, but instead of using a 30th of a second or a 60th of a second and just stopping the action, which is going to be blurry and not an attractive blurry, you're trying to add an artistic element, panning technique to the blur. My friend Adam Betcher over in Minnesota does a lot of different shooting with good action shutter speeds. Shooting 1/1000th, 2/1000th shutter speed to freeze the action is pretty amazing. He shoots for Getty Images, Associated Press. He's one of the big guys. I met him shooting the Packers-Viking games many years ago. And a fast shutter speed will freeze the action, getting an amazing shot. His turning of the camera at the right angle, getting some pretty cool shots there as well of the Minnesota Twins. A slow shutter speed might be something you want to experiment with. Nowadays, this was shot on the Canon R6 using the image stabilizer of the lens, which is super, super helpful. And I took about 24 pictures probably to get this one. A slow shutter speed, holding my breath, keeping the camera stable in my arms, bracing my arms into my torso. Got a good shutter speed to get the action slow enough and get some of the intensity as this security guard is watching everything happening at an event. The shutter speed kind of tells the story. So sometimes you might want to use a slower shutter speed. The slower shutter speed here, 1/80th of a second, actually didn't work very well because what happened is they were starting to dip, and as they started to dip, the slower shutter speed is showing blur in the same shot. Here, 100th of a second, not much different at all in shutter speed. And the subject's crisp and sharp. Why? Because she dipped, he held her, and when they're stopped and frozen, I took the picture. So there was no movement actually during the time. So sometimes timing your shot to be the right moment will give you the frozen action, because technically at that moment, the action stopped for a split second. So I hope this has helped you to choose the correct shutter speed when freezing human action. And as always, thanks for watching Better Pics in just a few clicks.